So in part one of this mini lecture, I described why the United States in the early 2000s was so enamored with the U.S. occupation of Japan as history, as a template for its occupation of Iraq. And of course, there are many, many reasons why that was not meant to be. But let's go back now just to the 1940s and 50s and forget about our contemporary resonance, forget about our current needs. Do not engage too much presentism. Let's just do some basic historiography. And let's look at sort of the positive narrative of the U.S. occupation of Japan, why it was seen as such a success story at the time. I mentioned in the first part of the lecture the lack of deaths by American forces, but it goes much beyond that. I think when we think about the U.S. occupation of Japan, the word reorientation often comes up, that Japan was turned really from looking at Asia toward looking at the United States. And a large amount of its trade begins, of course, to flow across the Pacific. Relationships are reestablished there. The Americans helped to open up Japan's trade routes in Southeast Asia. So a lot of the so-called domino theory or U.S. Cold War policy and even Vietnam and it's the U.S. anxiety about communism in Southeast Asia can be traced back to its desire to defend and protect Japan's trading relationships and its access to raw materials. So the Japanese occupation, the U.S. occupation of Japan, rather, is seen as an economic success because there's the revival of the Japanese economy, but again, a reorientation of that economy away from the mainland of Asia, away from China, communist China. The Americans didn't want Japan to trade with communist China. They didn't want them to trade with communist North Korea. They didn't want them to trade or normalize relations with the Soviets. Their relationships are looking southeast to Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and of course to the United States. There is a reorientation of Japan's political system and a removal of the instability of government by assassination. And it's in the famous phrase of the 1930s, the reduction of power of the military, really the ripping out of military generals as significant political figures. There are purges, which are pretty deep at the beginning, from 1945 and 46 into 1947. And the first phase of the occupation, which we really look at as the first 2 years, from 1945 to 47, are where American reformist energies are really at their peak. And what type of American energies? You have to remember there's a democratic regime in Washington, a democratic government. This is Harry Truman, who continued on as vice president from the deceased Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So that energy of the New Deal, oftentimes people talk about sort of the last spasm of the New Deal, does not occur in the United States, where Harry Truman, of course, quickly comes up against a Republican Congress. In 1948, he won re-election. He won election. And, but of course, the Congress goes Republican, so he is stymied in a lot of his desires. And the Americans get a Republican president in 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The election of 52, he's, of course, inaugurated in 53. But this idea that the American reformist zeal is that of the Democratic Party. Although MacArthur himself is a Republican, quite famously so, seeking the Republican nomination in 1948, possibly, but more likely in 1952. So he himself, though, is willing to allow these, and the people coming over from the U.S., more than 2,000 U.S. occupation officials, many of them being New Dealers. So this is not really socialism. It's more sort of something we might associate with Bernie Sanders, who calls himself a socialist. But in reality, it's mainly, he's a social democrat. So values you'd associate probably with Clement Attlee in the Labor Party. So more widespread health insurance for individuals, greater protection from mass, exploitation by banks, mass capital, better labor rights in terms of working hours, more rights for women, the attempt to get more women into politics, but also into the labor force in more highly educated jobs and things of that nature. And so these kind of rights that the Americans are today really wishing that they had. There's this ongoing debate, of course, in the United States. Why can't we have universal health insurance? Why is it such a stressful thing for an American to walk into a hospital? He's clutching his pocketbook immediately, he or she is. Even when you have health insurance, you can't really use it because it's too costly. So there's a real fear of that whole system. In Japan, the systems are better. There is more access to health insurance. There is more widespread social provision. Retirement age, things of this nature, labor laws are better. And this is largely because the United States was able to implement a New Deal agenda in early occupation Japan. And it's quite a progressive agenda. These are largely, again, Democrats who are placed into these various offices, running the education ministry, running the ministries of health, running the labor ministry, setting up the Constitution, writing in specific rights for women into the Constitution, rights about divorce, property rights, time off for maternity leave, things like this get written in. So it is a success from that standpoint from the United States, although if in 1947 there is the so-called reverse course where the United States backtracks a bit on some of these things out of fears that Japan might go communist or that leftists around Asia are going to kind of sweep Japan up in their wake and that communists are going to create instability in Japan. So there is a very famous moment. We'll talk more about that, about the reverse course later on. But it's still seen as a success and is still seen as transformative, either in the first phase from 45 to 47 or the second phase from 48 to 52. One thing that the United States sees the U.S. occupation of Japan as a success, one thing that makes the U.S. Look at the occupation as a success is something that does not happen. It's the dog that doesn't bark. And that is Japan's war-like activity, Japanese aggression, Japanese extension of its forces into the world. That doesn't happen. The Japanese write in fact they're forced to write by the Americans, a clause into the Constitution. It's called Article 9 IX. Article 9 1IX is the peace clause of the Constitution. And effectively it says the Japanese will never maintain large military forces. They will never extend military force beyond their borders. They will never again wage aggressive war. This is quite a bold thing. And a lot of people called the United States, early on a lot of Americans were upset about this because they thought, why don't we use Japanese troops in the Korean War? Why don't we send Japanese troops back to East Asia now that we've got this ally? And it's been 3 or 4 years since the war. Couldn't we use them as proxy forces? Why didn't, in an alternative history of the world, the United States never sends a single boy to Vietnam? They just send some advisors and use the Japanese military to go fight their battle, and the South Korean mercenaries to go fight their battles in Southeast Asia. But that doesn't happen for the Japanese. They did send South Korean soldiers to fight, tens of thousands of them, to the Vietnam War, but that's another story. So Japan is not an aggressive state. Japan is a stakeholder in the global community. Japan is a peaceful country. It follows Article 9. They do not spend large amounts on defense. So in this country, we're fixated on the 2% amount. There's NATO kind of sets the bar, right? We're all supposed to spend 2% on national defense. The United States is spending over 20% of its national income, national gross domestic product, on defense, right? The Defense Department is absolutely massive. I mean, it is a country within a country. And the reason that it's such a massive amount of expenditure is that they are effectively defending Japan and setting up a massive military state within a state in Japan, and they continue to do so. So they've also got troops in South Korea, as you know, about 30,000 plus American troops in South Korea today. But that allows the fact that there are American troops there rather than Japanese troops, that Japan is disallowed from using its military or spending really much money on that. They've got a Coast Guard, they've got police force, they've got what they call a self-defense force, which is not allowed to go out. And in fact, it's only the Iraq War of 2003 where they do finally send about 500 troops to Iraq. It's quite controversial, and they're basically handing out medical kits and giving sheiks large suitcases of money in certain Sunni regional areas to say, please do not shoot or abduct any of our Japanese soldiers because it's very, very sensitive for us to be out of our country 58 years or whatever after the end of World War II. Finally, here we are, the Japanese Self-Defense Force, projecting power into Iraq on behalf of the United States, and it's just microscopic, really. Now, why is that a success? It's a success because of the carnage of World War II. It's a success because the Japanese economy is able to really focus on rebuilding itself rather than spending money on defense. There's not a big burden. You look at a country like North Korea, also, like the United States, spending about over a quarter of its national income on self-defense. The South Koreans spent a lot of money on national defense, although they also had American patrons. So the fact that there's no aggressive war, Japan spending less than 2% of its national income on national defense throughout the height of the Cold War, even allows it to focus its funds on social programs. And even though they do kind of have a center right wing party, again, it's much more like the UK, as we mentioned, I think back in Lecture 1 or Lecture 2, where they do have quite a large domestic agenda, and they can also anchor their money or fix it to support industry for exporting goods. So that fact that it is no aggressive war is quite good for the economy. Japan is a stakeholder in the world community. You've got these kind of gold-plated events like the Olympics in Tokyo in 1964. There's another one coming up, allegedly, in July 2020. They contribute massively to the UN's budget, to global health funds. They funded the first Iraq war in 1990-91 when the United States and a coalition, including Great Britain, ejected Saddam Hussein from Iran, rather. Sorry, a Freudian slips there. Following the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, Saddam Hussein then invaded Kuwait in 1990. Margaret Thatcher and George H.W. Bush famously got together and decided this will not stand, and pulled together a coalition agreed to by the UN to fight and via Saudi Arabia invade Kuwait and oust Saddam Hussein from Kuwait without doing regime change. So that was a massive event in the early 1990s. Nobody ever thinks about Japan's role in that. Why would Japanese troops have participated? Of course they did not. They bankrolled almost half of the massive American war effort because the United States was basically supplying them with crude oil. We said, we are guaranteeing your supply of crude oil from the Persian Gulf. Would you mind chipping in? And this is what they did. It's called checkbook diplomacy. So the Japanese had loads of money in 1990, and they gave a large sum to the United States to pay off its war expenses in Iraq. And of course, the Americans then proceeded to suck a lot of money out of the Iraqi oil program thereafter. But the Japanese put down a huge down payment on that conflict. So the United States looks at Japan and says, great ally, great ally. Not an effective kind of projector of force, not a military ally, but a great military base, and a very, very wealthy ally. They're now, I think, third or fourth largest economy in the world, 125 million people, very, very prosperous, longest lifespan in the world, and high incomes, and still very friendly with the United States, and as I said, a lot of trade with the U.S., as well as the U.K., which is a whole other subject, which we've talked about previously. Finally, the Japanese role in the world means they have, and I think this is key for us when we look at week 10 and week 11, they have alignment with South Korea, but not an alliance. So you'll recall that Japan normalizes relations with South Korea in 1965, and that this puts a cap on South Korean claims for war crimes or for forced labor, things of that nature, in the Second World War. But more importantly, it meant that they exchanged ambassadors, and that trade picked up between South Korea and Japan. These are very complementary economies. You'll recall that the Japanese occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945. It was a full-on colony. Koreans basically lost their national identity. They were all protected by the Japanese. You had Koreans in Manchuria who were protected by the Japanese, who became Japanese subjects. Manchukuo then absorbs even more Koreans, more than 2 million in fact, and some of them went back to Korea. And they have a Korean population, the Zainichi Koreans, as a result of all that migration from the early 20th century and into the, particularly getting mixed up during the Second World War. So you have between 700,000 and 1 million Zainichi Koreans who are living in Japan as basically permanent guests. They don't really have dual nationality. They have these funny passports and an interesting status. It's a bit like being a Hong Kong Chinese with the right to live in London under the right circumstances, and the Home Office is not going to allow you to send your children to primary school for free. You might be double taxed in the NHS, things like that. So the Koreans in Japan who have been living there for 3-4 generations now are in that type of system, and they're there after World War II. And I think we look at it in the United States, putting on the U.S. we for a second here, as kind of a big success overall, this relationship between South Korea and Japan. Yeah, they have a few issues about the history issue, the history problem, the Yenfu Mundai, as it's called in Japanese, the comfort women problem. But apart from that, there's a lot of trade between the two countries, and they're both allies. The United States has got forces in both areas to support the missions that they have out there. But under the surface, there's a real churn, right? Besides the history problem, there's discrimination against Koreans in Japan today, and those roots go back to the U.S. occupation, really, with repatriation and MacArthur's decisions to basically treat them as so-called third country nationals. So this is a little bit of the kind of the negative side of things, or the less positive view that we'll get into a little bit later. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that positive view, and I want to talk about the Reischauer view and some views that came up kind of a first draft of history by John Gunther, writing about MacArthur. But for interests of kind of speed, I will stop here and move into part 3 to talk a little bit about that, the Reischauer view of why Japan is such a success, and why MacArthur specifically is such a central figure.